Yeah, good morning, everybody. Here to our participants in the United States, and good afternoon to our participants and colleagues in Europe. A warm welcome to all of you to our discussion, Change and Challenges after the European elections, the new European Parliament, and the Transatlantic future. My name is Hardy Ostrom. I'm the resident representative of the Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung in the United States. And today we have a great panel here with us to discuss the results from last weekend's elections in Europe. And I would like to introduce my colleague, Dr. Beatrice Guavanci, who's head of the European office of the Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung, Brussels. Warm welcome, Beatrice. Great to have you.
Good afternoon from Brussels.
And then we have Klaus Welle, the chairman of the Martens Academic Council and long-serving Secretary General of the European Parliament. Dear Klaus, also a great pleasure to have you.
Thank you, Hardy.
And last but not least, a very important voice from the United States, Frances Burwell. She is at the Atlantic Council here in Washington and very much inside of all what happens with regard to EU and US relations. Friend, a great pleasure to have you with us today.
Very glad to be here, Hardy.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We would start our discussion by having first a look on the results of what happened not only the last weekend, but as you know, the European elections took place over 3 days from the 6th to 9th of June in Europe. And I would like to ask my colleague Beatrice to make us familiar with the outcome of these elections for the European Parliament, for its composition, but also what it will mean for the political priorities in the next coming 5 years. Beatrice, please.
Thank you very much, Hardy. Let me put my short presentation under 3 headlines: the winners, the losers, and possible surprises. Maybe some facts and figures at the beginning. You mentioned already that the European parliamentary elections took place over several days. Around 360 million eligible voters were called upon to cast their vote in the largest transnational election in the world to elect the 720 members of the upcoming 10th Parliament, in Europe. So for the first time, also as an additional information, 16-year-olds were allowed to vote in Germany, Belgium, Malta, and Austria, and 17 years old in Greece. And voters' turnout in a pan-European context increased slightly to 51% compared to 50-something in the last European elections in 2019. Of course, there were individual differences in the respective European countries. There are countries like Belgium and Luxembourg where there is a compulsory voting. So we had a very high turnout, between 82 and 90% voters turnout. And the lowest figure was reported to us from Croatia with only 21%. Now, coming to the results, the winners and the losers. So the obvious winner of the election is the European People's Party, as you can see on the chart, with lead candidate Ursula von der Leyen and a clear lead over the S&D group, the group of the Social Democrats and Socialists, more than 50 seats difference between both parties. The Liberal Renew group loses heavily, coming down from 102 seats to 79, but remains the third strongest group, at least as we speak now and today. The Greens suffered heavy losses. They lost almost 20 seats, I think 19 seats, and now only have 53 seats. In the previous parliament, the Greens were the 4th largest parliamentary group. Now they are on place 6. That means they fall back behind the right-wing conservative ECR and the far-right ID. The right-wing and far-right groups emerged stronger from the vote. The right-wing conservative ECR parliamentary group increased its number of seats from 69 to 73, with a radical right-wing ID parliamentary group that rose from 49 to 58. And we will see how that develops in the next days. This leads me to the conclusion, at least for now, that the EPP is clearly the strongest party, and we could say that the political center is very stable. as Ursula von der Leyen pointed it out in Brussels at the election evening at the EPP on Sunday. And that also means that the EPP has an absolute key role to play in the European Parliament and therefore also in the legislative process. So the dramatic shift to the right, at least if we see Europe as a whole in the pan-European context, did so far not materialize. But of course, there is a shift to the right in some individual European countries, for example, in France, Austria, and Germany, but I'm sure we will come to this later in the discussion. Let me just take a last look at the seat projection. If we put everything together, the seat projection, the EPP together with the Social Democrats, together with the Liberal group, what does that mean for the election of the Commission President? Together, they would have at least 400, maybe 401 or 2 seats. And as a reminder for our audience, 361 votes are needed to elect the Commission President. So in purely mathematical terms, this coalition would have a comfortable majority for the election of the Commission President. But you must also consider in all groups, there are dissenting opinions, maybe up to 10 or 15%. And we also have to bear in mind that it is a secret ballot in which an absolute majority is required. There will also remain some other imponderabilities. We still have a large group of non-attached MEPs, and we will see where they go. We have also a large group of new MEPs who do not yet belong to any group. So what I want to say is that the majority ratio could still change before the first week of the parliamentary session in Strasbourg, middle of July. The political groups are trying to recruit parties that have recently entered the European Parliament as members. It cannot be ruled out that new political groups will emerge or that groups will disintegrate. And as a reminder, a political group must have at least 23 members from 7 or more member states. This means that there can be some surprises. There were also other surprises during the election, but maybe I come to this at a later stage.
Yeah, thank you very much, Beatrice, for this first overview with regard to the results and the possible shapings of the different parliamentary groups. In between, I also would like to invite our participants, please, to actively participate in our discussion. If you would like to ask a question or put a comment, then please use our Q&A section in your toolbar. Now I would like to ask Klaus, as a long-time not only observer, but actor inside of the European Parliament. Klaus, what is your assessment of these results, and especially when we have a look forward to the future configuration of all the political tendencies and groups?
Yeah, thank you very much, Hardy. A couple of remarks from my side. First, this is not just an isolated election, but we can now look back to a period where at least for 30 years, the European People's Party has been the dominant political force in Europe since the election in 1999. And that wasn't always the case. From 1979 to 1999, it were the socialists. So this is really remarkable. And the degree of this success this time, more than 50 votes ahead of the socialists, is giving a very clear mandate for Ursula von der Leyen, the EPP lead candidate, to also run as the president for the next European Commission and look for that nomination, probably even earlier, relatively quickly in July, maybe as quickly as next week already. This also means that the new principle, which was introduced in 2014, that all the European political parties present lead candidates, and that those lead candidates are presented to the voters with the ambition to then run the European executive, the European Commission, that this lead candidate principle is back. Ursula von der Leyen was the lead candidate of the EPP. She's by far won the most seats, had the biggest support, and therefore the lead candidate principle is back. Something which is politically very important is that the so-called progressive majority, that means a possibility for the Liberals, the Greens, the Socialists, and the Left Party to go together and then outvote the European People's Party, that has always existed and was used in about 10, 15, 20% of the cases of legislation. That progressive majority, for the first time ever in European Parliament election, does not exist anymore. Those parties together have roughly, I think the last figure I've seen, 307 votes. 361 are needed to be the majority. So the EPP, in principle, if it doesn't divide itself, cannot be outvoted anymore in legislation. And that's something very important on, let's say, very ambitious proposals, for example, in the environmental area or also on cultural issues. There's also no majority on the right, not because the numbers wouldn't be there, but because the Christian Democrats and the extreme right are exact opposites. The extreme right wants to destroy what Christian Democrats have built after the Second World War with European integration and transatlantic partnership, especially on the ID group side. They are pretty close to Russia, which in these times is really not understandable. So the majority has to come out of the center. EPP, Socialist, Liberals, as Beatrice Gorobanci has already said, have about 400 seats, even a little bit more. For legislation, that's far more than enough. For the vote on the Commission President, could be a bit tight because there's sometimes some deviation. So there will later on surely also be contacts with the Greens on the one side, but also with constructive conservatives, the constructive right, which for me is Madame Meloni in Italy, also the ODS, also the NBA, for their support for the Commission President. As Beatrice Gorobanci has said, populism is not only limited to the right. We also have now, in principle, the numbers for a left populist group with the 5 stars in Italy, also with the Wagenknecht party in Germany, and the parties of the Slovak government, which have been suspended from the socialists. So left-wing populism means left on economics, but right-wing on cultural issues, immigration, and relatively close being to Russia. One other thing to look at is that the SND now has to sort out its leadership issues, because traditionally they entrust the leadership to the biggest delegation. That's no longer the Spanish delegation, it's now the Italian delegation. Remains to be seen whether there's a leadership change for that group. And there are also issues in the Liberal Renew group, because the VVD party, a very traditional right-wing liberal party in the Netherlands, has entered into a coalition with the very right, and therefore there's the question mark, should they be excluded or not from the Liberal Renew group in the European Parliament? That's contested, and that might very well lead to a couple of frictions within that group. Before the elections, it was expected that maybe President Macron of France would have completely different ideas on the leadership of the next European Commission. I think he has now a lot of issues open in France itself. So I expect an easier consensus on the leadership functions in the European Union, which might already lead to a situation that already still in July, the European Parliament can vote the new leadership of the European Commission into office. Another word on the EPP. It's not only that the EPP is now by far the biggest group in the European Parliament with more than 50 votes ahead. It has also got 12 presidents or prime ministers in the European Council, whereas the Socialists and Liberals have only 4 or 5. And the other ones are to the right of the EPP. So the EPP is very comfortably placed in the center also of the European Council, and can also expect to have quite a number of commissioners. So this should be a legislature where the EPP, both in the Parliament and in the Council, and also in the European Commission, should have an absolutely critical central role. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Klaus, for these insights. And now I would like to ask Fran for your assessment on the outcome of these European elections and the possible future European Commission, and how and in which regard it matters for the US and the Biden administration, and probably at a later stage we might also discuss what might it mean for another administration following after the 20th of January next year.
Well, let me first say that this European Parliament election was covered much more in the US media than any previous one that I can remember. But a lot of it was about the far right coming to power in Europe. And so I think it's important to say that based on the numbers and various other factors, that the center has held. EPP, as everyone has pointed out, is the strongest party, and EPP and S&D are the only two parties with more than 100 MEPs. How it actually turns out in the end, what is the coalition that will run the parliament? Klaus has pointed to a whole lot of potential question marks and changes that will have to be navigated. But I think that for an American audience, what I would say is, yes, there is a long-term kind of secular move to the right, triggered by migration and economic issues. But this is not the end of Europe as we know it as a regulatory superpower, or as a place that is more centrist than extreme, in terms particularly of the impact on policy. And I would underscore for the American audience to remember that the Parliament does not have the right of initiation of legislation, unlike Congress. And so the Commission, and Klaus has said some very interesting things about the makeup of the Commission, is really the place that starts legislation. Parliament can indicate what they'd like to see, and they certainly have a role. And I think that in the past, on the digital and green agendas, Parliament sometimes pushed farther to the left when presented with legislation. If anything, now I would expect a more moderate tone when greeted with legislation from the Commission. From a US perspective, I kind of went through some issues. And so this is having said, how limited or the extent to which Parliament will be limited in actual legislation. I think three areas: the economic agenda, Ukraine, and China. So the economic agenda, I expect now that we will see the competitiveness agenda that has been outlined not only by Commission President von der Leyen, but also by Enrique Letta. And we're all waiting for Mario Draghi's report as well. I imagine that will be the agenda that drives the next commission. From a US perspective, this is important because it is a focus on implementing the single market in some key areas, defense, telecoms, financial services. And there may be some bumps in the road in terms of the United States. Currently, for example, Europe buys much of its weaponry from the United States. The defense industrial based strategy has a target of having, I think it's 40% of European procurement at a certain time bought from Europeans. And so this may cause some concerns, but I think overall, the attitude in the United States will be Europe needs to strengthen its defenses. This is a good thing. But there may be some, just little tensions here and there. I also think that we are not likely to see any rollback of some of the legislation that is concerning to some US companies. So on the digital agenda, Digital Markets Act, for example, Digital Services Act, I don't see any serious rollback. On things like deforestation, CBAM, corporate sustainability, and due diligence, perhaps this will send a message that reinforces the need to be more flexible on implementation as we see the implementing rules come out of the Commission on these things, perhaps. But I would not, if I were at an American company or an American policymaker anticipate that this solidification on the center right is going to lead to a real shift in legislation that already exists, perhaps some of the legislation that did not make it through this parliament for time issues and other reasons, in part because of EPP opposition. Some of that may not resurface in the next commission. So a very moderate impact on that, on the economic agenda. On Ukraine, I don't see, again, much impact except for two. One is more mixed messages from parliamentarians, in part because there will be more on the right and kind of the pro-Russia area who now have a platform. And that's a little problematic. But I know that the EPP and the major parties there are very strong together on Ukraine. And they will be the dominant voice. The other one is how to pay for everything. And here, the EPP has raised questions about this. And I think we will see an agreement at the G7 this weekend or the next couple days about how to take the interest off Ukrainian assets and use it. The US and the EU have finally apparently made an agreement on that. I think that may be more difficult in the future to talk about mutualization of debt in order to fund what is needed to do in Ukraine. On China, I think here in Washington, there's a very positive view of the new tariffs on electric vehicles. And that is not the case across the EPP, and particularly in Germany. So I think the issue of China is one that is going to be a little fractious on occasion. The real impact for the United States, though, is in the member states and the fallout from the election in the member states. Chancellor Scholz is weakened. His coalition is weakened. Will they manage to hang together and get over some of this fractious internal fighting that has been going on for a while? You know, the United States wants Germany to be able to move forward and be supportive on Ukraine without going back and forth all the time. Macron is the big question mark. And my nightmare is that the NATO summit is July 9th, 2 days after his election results. If he shows up in Washington for this giant party with everybody, and he is now sitting with a government that is much less committed to the support of Ukraine, that will be noted in the American media. And I think that will cause more questioning about how willing is Europe to stay supportive of Ukraine over the long term. Much American media and many conservative Americans believe that Europe is not fully committed and is not doing enough. And if you're in Europe, you know that it's very different, and Europe is really pulling hard on this. But the potential of the French election to feed into this argument about Europe not doing enough gives me concern. The instability in Germany and France leads me to emphasize the role of the president of the Commission. President von der Leyen is well known here. It's very clear that she gets on very well with President Biden. And she is largely seen here as someone who has represented the EU extremely well on some key issues, and that she is a real transatlanticist. She damped down the issue of the inflation resulting from the Inflation Reduction Act. When she and Macron went to China, the US was far more sympathetic to the tougher line that she took. So I think that this raises, from the US perspective, the desirability of, shall we say, constancy and consistency in the presidency commission. But we will just have to see. The other person who, in US eyes, has done very well out of this election is Giorgia Meloni, who is popular here because of her support on Ukraine, and is not seen as far right. She is, I think, Klaus, you used the term, the constructive right. And I would say that she is viewed that way here. Whether if we have a second Trump administration, this new parliament and new commission will shift anything that would happen. I'm very doubtful. I think I have no idea how President Trump would get on with a newly reappointed President von der Leyen. We will just have to see. And I think, though, that the EPP is not the same kind of conservative that President Trump would be. And so there will continue to be issues between the US and the EU of a fairly basic nature, should he be reelected. And the election doesn't really change that.
Thank you very much, Fran. And by touching upon already some of also critical issues, critical files, which might still exist between the EU and the US, I just would like to come back to Beatrice, because this question, or this, especially through the media reported narrative, this strong shift to the right, which might be seen as one result of these elections. I think we will get a closer, when we have a closer look on the national results of these elections, then the picture is much more clearer. Could you please outline a little bit how you see that, and what is your assessment?
Yeah, thank you very much, Hadi. And I'm also grateful to Frances when she reiterated once again the fact that an important outcome of the election was that the political center holds. And that is, I think, the message which comes out of this the elections. But before the elections, of course, they were declared to be the elections of the destiny. So the choice between democracy and freedom on the one hand, or on the other hand, by those driven by ideology who want less Europe or even reject it in principle. As far as the shift to the right is concerned, I think we clearly need to differentiate between the pan-European level and the individual member states. And on the European level as such, I would say it's maybe a little shift to the right, but not the dramatic shift to the right. But of course, there were some individual countries where we see an extreme shift to the right. And I'm pretty sure we will still discuss France. There was also Austria, and of course, Germany, with AfD being on the second place after the CDU. But in my statement at the very beginning, I also mentioned that there were some surprises where we can see that, for example, where an extreme shift to the right was expected, in the end, it didn't take place. And let me elaborate a little bit on that. Look at Hungary. Nobody had expected from the beginning or before the elections that Viktor Orban's former party friend and now opponent, Peter Magyar, that he was able to attract out of the blue and, so to speak, from a standing start, 30% of the electorate with his new party called TISA. And now the MEPs from that party, they will move to the EPP. There were also surprises in Poland, where Prime Minister Donald Tusk's conservative civic platform won the European elections, I think, for the first time after 10 years. And let us also take a look to the Northern Europe, to Scandinavia, especially Sweden, where people voted completely against the trend. The far right had no chance, and the Greens achieved good results. And maybe a last example, the Netherlands. Everybody expected, and of course, Geert Wilders and his right-wing populist party has won 6 seats in the European Parliament from a standing start, but still the Social Democrats are slightly ahead, which is a symbolically important victory for that party. So what I wanted to say, on the pan-European level, no dramatic shift to the right, but in some individual countries, yes, and in some not. So there is a kind of heterogeneous picture.
Thank you very much, Beatrice, for these informations. And now I would like to hand over to Klaus. Probably, Klaus, you could comment again on what Beatrice mentioned with regard to the different countries, but also what that might mean for the next couple of days when we have the parliament sitting together, creating their new parliamentary groups, and where there is still some flexibility by configuring the parliamentary groups.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks very much for that question. I think the description was absolutely right, that a good part of what was expected didn't happen. The development in Hungary, very important. Now, in fact, a center-right opposition to Viktor Orban, which is in line with the EPP and which is joining the EPP. You know, there was a lot of debate. Meloni had a fantastic result, yes, but that means that a constructive right, the party of Madame Meloni, has replaced members of a destructive right, which were the members of Salvini. So I would say a net plus in the balance sheet. Germany, I wouldn't be too worried about, because, you know, the next commission really takes up work in the next year. And that's when we already have elections in Germany. And if current opinion polls prove right, then there are all chances that Friedrich Merz is the new chancellor in Germany. And that this coalition, which isn't a coalition, which is a compilation of three parties who don't really like to work together, would be replaced by something new and hopefully much more solid. The complexities of the European election are that you are not voting for a European party, you're voting for national parties. And some of these national parties have not yet made that choice where they're going to go. And traditionally, most of this potential is on the right, on the very right, because there are reasons why they've been taken on board. So I would just like to say there might be still some increase in the membership figures in the ECR group and in the ID group. The ECR group could even pass by the Liberals as the third biggest force, even though that's more, let's say, a kind of honorary title. It's not so important in the real work. And it is visible that the German AfD, which was excluded from the ID group because of racism, closeness to Russia, closeness to China, a spy scandal, that they try to somehow get back in, because the most contested member, Mr. Krah, was not accepted in the AfD delegation. There are more. There's a number 2 on the list. Mr. Bistrom is also very contested, number 3 as well. But I wouldn't exclude that one time after the French election, at least a certain number of the AfD members could find again a home, for example, in the ID group. But it doesn't change the basic message. This is a parliament which will be run by the moderate center-right, the moderate center-left, and the center, with the European People's Party in the key role. They have enough votes to control the legislative process. If they are disciplined, they also have enough votes to get the next Commission president elected among themselves, which should be Ursula von der Leyen, and to get the new Commissioners College into office. So the message is much more continuity than disruption. But the one exception on the national level really is France, where President Macron made out of a very bad election night a potential catastrophe politically for his own country by dissolving the parliament, because it might be that there's an extreme right majority, but there could equally be a kind of hung parliament where nevertheless there's a majority on the very right plus on the very left, and governing that country could become very difficult. Fortunately, the state president has prerogatives in the area of foreign affairs, security and defense, and on European affairs. So that would allow to kind of control the damage. But I think and I fear the damage in France is done.
Thank you very much, Klaus. I just would like to touch upon 2 points Fran mentioned already in her statement, and this is NATO, the upcoming summit here in Washington, and the fact that Ursula von der Leyen announced already in her campaign that she would like to nominate, with regard to the new commission, also a new industrial defense commissioner. So completing the DG defense, if we may so. What that might mean also in a US perspective? And the second point, China. I think this is still something where we not always agree. And as you mentioned, especially automobile industry is not always happy when Europe raises tariffs on Chinese cars. So how do you think that the US and the new commission might come together and find a stronger and deeper agreement with regard to that?
So on NATO and defense, I expect that in terms of organizing appointing a defense commissioner, or a defense industry commissioner, I should say, I think it will depend who it is, and it will depend what the mandate is. Americans who are not following the EU all the time have a hard time figuring out who all these people are and what their different roles are. So many people that I've talked to here anticipate that this would be like a defense minister. But that's not the case, right? I mean, it really is about coordinating an industrial realignment that needs to happen in Europe. So there are not so many national supply chains. And it's going to take someone who can knock heads together and say, you know, in order to get the type of defense equipment that we need out of the budget that we have, we can't just each defend all our own national defense champions. So it's going to be a very tough portfolio and I think it's going to move slowly. There'll be a lot of brouhaha at the beginning. And then the other issue is, from an outsider's perspective, how does that fit with the high representative, who is seen as kind of the foreign minister, but does the defense minister also talk about foreign policy, or are they just talking about kind of the mechanics of defense policy and defense industry-based growth? So I think that there will be some misapprehension at times, but I think the EU needs to be very clear about what the mandate is for this person. And then I think there is a real consensus among most people here in Washington that the EU has taken huge strides since the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. You know, I've watched the EU for many years, and to see the defense fund go from sending helmets and things like that to small countries that needed to reinforce their peacekeeping operations to supplying lethal weaponry to Ukraine. This is a huge shift. And on China, I think, and on the NATO summit, I think it's important because even though the EU usually comes, so usually both the Commission President and the Council President come to the NATO summit. That has happened for quite some time. And it's a good opportunity for the leadership to show that the EU has a defense side. It would also be great if we could get more NATO-EU cooperation. There are reasons that that doesn't happen, but particularly if we assume that Mark Rutte will come in, maybe it is time for a shift, and you know, the new leader in NATO, maybe something can be done. I'm not optimistic on that, but we'll see. In any event, it's important for everyone to be together. I think this is the 75th anniversary, and it will be very much pomp and circumstance, as we say here. So on China, I think this is going to be an issue. Von der Leyen countered our initial rhetoric about decoupling with de-risking. And that was adopted very quickly by the Biden administration, and they still use it. And many people here don't remember that that's where the term came from. But nevertheless, but I do think that there is a growing intensity of suspicion about China here, and particularly among Republicans, but not just Republicans and not just Trump Republicans. There are real concerns about China. And we see this especially in Congress, where there have been legislative proposals not only the TikTok ban, but things like keeping China from purchasing land in certain areas in the United States. It turns out that most of the land that they do own is Chinese companies from buying land. And it turns out most of the land they do own comes from their investments in the pork industry. So these are pig farms. So, but there are concerns, and some of them are legit, but others are legitimate, but others are a little bit the politicians trying to show how tough they are on China, right? I do think that we have not, the US and Europe, have not figured out how to deal together with Chinese overcapacity. And here we have the very stalled steel and aluminum negotiations, but also EVs and other things. I mean, we put up tariffs enough so that there will be no Chinese EVs in the US market to any extent. Where does that overcapacity go? Well, Europe is one place it could go. And I think that that's one reason that the tariffs were a bit higher than expected. I think it was also, you know, an opportunity to show that Europe wants to be tough on China, but also to balance the interests of the automobile industry and others who have extensive connections in China. So I expect that China is going to continue to be an issue where we're kind of converging, but we are a bit more, the US is tougher, more absolutist, if I can put it that way. One thing that does worry me is if we have another weather balloon incident, that Congress then may take some action that would be very difficult for the EU to deal with and to show that it would be supportive of. And that would deepen the potential for disagreement over China.
Thank you very much, Fran. With regard to the time, we still have 14-15 minutes. I just would like to have a look on our Q&A chat. And there is Max Primark. Hi, Max. He is asking one question with regard to the parliament and the configuration prospect for EPP-ECR coalition based on von der Leyen-Meloni strong relationship. I guess, Klaus, probably you like to answer to that.
Yeah, I think it's pretty simple. The coalition, there are no formal coalitions in the European Parliament, but the core of the cooperation will be between EPP, the Socialists, and the Liberals. But it's also true that Ursula von der Leyen, also Manfred Weber, but also Ursula von der Leyen, has developed a very good relationship with Giorgia Meloni. So I would expect that they want to continue that very good relationship, especially when it comes to migration issues, but not only. You remember that there was a lot of travel of the two ladies to countries of the southern Mediterranean, doing agreements on immigration control. So I expect Giorgia Meloni to vote for Ursula von der Leyen in the European Council when there is a vote. I also expect the Prime Minister from ODS in the Czech Republic to vote for Ursula von der Leyen in the European Council. And therefore, I would also expect their members in the European Parliament to vote for Ursula von der Leyen in the European Parliament, as I would expect the NVA members from Belgium, whose party president now has gotten the mandate to look for whether he can't form a new government in Belgium. So 3 very important personalities. And so if the prime ministers go that direction, very difficult to imagine that the members of parliament wouldn't be supportive. So that could be another 30 votes. So I don't expect a formal coalition. Anyhow, that doesn't exist in the European Parliament. I expect a strong cooperation around the center. But the EPP is making a clear difference between Meloni, NVA, ODS, who are constructive, and on the other hand, those who are destructive and try to destroy the European Union, who are sitting further to the right.
Thank you very much. And there's just another question from Alexander Privitera. how significant is the fact that despite a clear majority in the EP, Christian Democrats are underrepresented in the European Commission? Could it mean more interinstitutional friction? I think, Klaus, this goes also to you, but even the other colleagues.
I think Christian Democrats will not be underrepresented in the next European Commission. I think they will be very well represented. 12 prime ministers could hint at 12 commissioners, but there are even figures out of up to 15 commissioners coming from the EPP family based on some research which has been done. So that's an impressive figure for a political force that is only, let's say, 25% roughly of the seats in the European Parliament. So in fact, the EPP is quite well represented, and also the Commission has moved from being a collegial organ very much to a presidential system because of the number of 27. So the president of the Commission is very, very strong. The head of cabinet of the president of the Commission is very, very strong. So I think these two will be absolutely decisive if Ursula von der Leyen is going to be re-elected in the Commission system. So the EPP will play a very big role, maybe even an outsized role, both in the Parliament and in the Council and in the European Commission.
Thank you very much. And Alexander is clarifying that he also meant the Council. So, but in the Council, we have currently, I guess, 13 or 14 members coming from the EPP family, yeah?
Yeah, we have 12 in the European Council. If we count the Cypriot president, who was a member of the EPP, he wasn't nominated as a candidate. He ran as an independent. He was successful. But according to my information, he's now participating in EPP summits to prepare European Council. So I think it's fair to count him into the family. So then we would be at 12.
Yeah. Great. Thank you very much. Due to the fact that we already started to discuss the priorities of this next commission, and Fran touched upon already the fact that it's very probable that we have to see a change of priorities. When the Green Deal was quite important during this first mandate of Ursula von der Leyen, it's very probable that we will have a new agenda setting, new priorities. So to sum up our discussions, I would like to ask all three of you what you guess should be the priorities with regard to the working program of this commission, which, as Klaus mentioned, if there might be the election already next week or in July, then they have really to hurry up to design this working program and to set the priorities for the von der Leyen II commission. So what is your assessment with regard to that? Beatrice, probably you would like to start.
Yeah, I think the topic was already mentioned, especially by Francis, the defense issue. I think that will be clearly one very important topic for the Commission. And it's not just about increasing the military power of the individual member states, but also fundamentally about improving European defense capabilities, especially with regard to armaments cooperation. And as it was already discussed, there was already the talk about a defense commissioner who, in case he or she will be established, that will be an important task to perform. And let me add just one point on what Francis has said about that, especially on deepening. That person could have a very deepening task to deepen the EU-NATO relations in such a way that measures by both organizations, of course supported by European legislation and budgetary resources, could have a complementary effect, especially with regard to hybrid threats. Because I think that will be a big challenge for the future, like cybersecurity and counterterrorism.
Thank you, Beatrice. Klaus?
Yeah, I would also start with defense. I've also been coordinating for the Martin Center a 10-point plan, defense in depth, how to become a viable partner, in fact, for the United States. And that means we have to put ourselves in a position for a fair burden sharing. And a lot goes through the European Union, also the next European Union budget. That paper can be downloaded in the Martin Center. I would also add growth, as it has been said. The papers of Enrico Letta and Mario Draghi have not been commissioned for nothing. We need more growth also for the viability of our debt. For this, you need growth. Thirdly, I think there are a lot of now financial burdens coming up. Climate change agenda, if it's meant seriously, will need about 800 billion in investment. That cannot just come from national budgets. That cannot just come from private money. So there, at a certain moment, there will also be the question, can we finance this also together on the European level? And what form would it take? And some countries might suggest Next Generation EU 2.0. But it's not just climate change. It's defense, which needs money. It's a changed demographic situation, which needs money. And if we are really serious about the enlargement of the European Union, it will not be possible to do that with 1% of GDP for the European Union. That kind of enlargement would be finished by the Polish farmers on their own, already demonstrating permanently on the Polish-Ukrainian border. So budget issues will figure prominently, and climate change policy has to put from the head onto its feet, and the feet very much concern issues of finance.
Thank you, Klaus. And from NRE's perspective, what should be the priorities of the next commission? And probably, if you're allowed to add, how in this framework, the TTC, for example, as one instrument, which is half empty, half blank, how would you like to see it? But how the TTC could also play a new role in giving a new dynamic to this very important relationship between the EU and the US.
Thank you. I agree with my colleagues. I think the number one issue, there are two kind of paired number one issues that I would have for Europe. One is the economy and the competitiveness agenda. And here I would point to Letta's emphasis on capital markets union and kind of capital markets union plus. As someone who's covered tech policy for a while, it's very clear that within there is no single market in financial services and capital markets. And that is something that is really impeding the scaling up of Europe's innovative but small companies. So I think that that's something that, from an American perspective, we look at Europe and we say, why don't you have any big tech companies of your own? And this is something that I think would go a long way toward boosting Europe in that way. I agree with everything that was said about defense. I think there also needs to be a serious focus on implementation. The Commission has been the proposer, but it has usually relied on the member states to implement. And we are seeing a lot of differences in the way member states implement, even regulations as opposed to directives. And so I think given the tsunami wave, if I can put it that way, of legislation that we saw in the tech and green area over the last commission, a pause to kind of get things moving forward. The commission is taking on more of an enforcement role itself. Look at the Digital Markets Act, Digital Services Act, the AI Act with the new AI office. So the commission needs to understand how to implement these things because it's never really been responsible for that. I'm probably not going to be satisfied with what happens because the commission exists in a sense to propose legislation. And so that's kind of the way it thinks about things. So I'm not sure it will take a pause. I also think that there needs to be a continuing effort that has been led by Commissioner Jourova, for example, on rule of law and also on particularly disinformation and the quality of information, because I think that's partially responsible for people wasting their votes, essentially, by voting for the ID and farther to the right, especially the non-aligned, which saw a big increase in seats, proportionally speaking. And so those MEPs are never going to be part of the power structure in the European Parliament. And so it's not, it's a protest vote against the national government. I think Europe needs to focus more on how to build kind of that European electorate. And I know that Klaus especially has thought about that over the years. TTC, I actually think it's been very successful with what it was given. And that it has, on the American side, really raised the stature of the EU as an institution and the Commission as an institution. There's been a lot of good work done on AI in particular, and we're now seeing that move into quantum. And you really see a Biden administration that came into office not really thinking about AI. Now, some of the stuff that is written in Washington by the government about AI could have been written in Brussels. So, I mean, I think that much to the dismay of some of the companies, and I think, maybe we shouldn't go that far, but on the other hand, I think we've seen a really remarkable convergence there. And I see that when we have disagreements, such as the IRA, and as I fear we may have more over China, the TTC provides an opportunity both to vent and also to think about a more constructive way forward. What it has not done is been able to resolve some serious challenges. So the Critical Minerals Accord, the Green Steel Accord. Whether the TTC is able to do that, I think is a real challenge. And I'm not sure that, I think it was right not to give the TTC that when it was brand new. Don't kill the baby before it grows up, right? But I think now we should ask ourselves, how do we actually resolve those issues? Is the TTC the right instrument? If we have a Biden 2 administration, I think the TTC will restructure a little bit, but it will continue to be a very political, even geopolitical at times, mechanism for relations between the US and the EU. If we have a Trump presidency, I think we are talking about a different type of undertaking, one that reverts to a much more technical, working level type of associations on particular issues. Those dialogues may be able to make progress under those circumstances.
Thank you very much, Fran, for this assessment. Thank you to all our speakers. It was really a great pleasure to get these insights from Brussels and from Washington and the US. Thanking to our participants for your questions, comments, and remarks. And we wish you from Washington, DC all the best. Stay healthy and have a nice evening or still a nice day. Thank you very much.
Thank you.